When my parents thought I was a mistake, school was hell, and the only adult who cared led me closer to God, and I never asked to be born, but it always felt like I had to apologize for existing anyway. The earliest memory I can recall with complete clarity is hearing my mother on the phone with someone, maybe a friend or her sister, and saying in a flat voice, "Well, David was a mistake. We were done having kids." I don't think she knew I was listening, hiding behind the corner with my favorite action figure in my hand, Frozen. I was 10, and I already understood that I was an inconvenience in my own house. My father, Frank, wasn't the shouting type, but he had a way of making every word feel like a slap to the face. He had these rules, unspoken, rigid, impossible to live up to. Real men don't cry. Real men don't complain. Real men don't ask to be seen. I did my best to shrink myself into invisibility, thinking maybe if I was quiet enough, still enough, they'd forget I existed, and that would be better for everyone. My younger sister Madison, 2 years younger than me, was the golden child from the start. Every drawing she brought home went on the fridge. Every tiny accomplishment was met with applause. I once won third place in a local spelling bee, and when I handed my mother the certificate, she glanced at it like it was a parking receipt, then asked if I'd fed the dog yet. The dog didn't even like me. The only time my father showed any emotion was when I messed up, which didn't take much. Once, I forgot to take out the trash, and he looked me in the eye and said, "You're not cut out for anything, David." That sentence stayed with me longer than I care to admit. School wasn't any better. I didn't fit anywhere. I was too quiet for the loud kids, too awkward for the cool ones, and too anxious to even try joining any group. I ate alone every day in the cafeteria, sitting at the far corner of the bench with my back to the wall so no one could sneak up behind me. I knew how to time my steps in the hallway to avoid certain people, especially Josh, who liked to trip me or slap my books out of my hands. Teachers rarely noticed, and when they did, they assumed I must have done something to provoke it. I started drawing during class, not for fun, but to disappear. One Monday, Josh, one of the louder boys in my class, pulled my chair out just as I was sitting down, sending me crashing onto the floor in front of everyone. Everyone laughed. Even the teacher smirked before telling us to get to work. I stayed on the floor for a few seconds longer than I should have, trying to pretend it didn't hurt. But it did, physically, emotionally, everything. The worst part wasn't even the fall. It was the way I looked up and realized no one expected me to fight back. Not even me. Miss Teresa was the only adult who didn't seem like she had already made up her mind about me. She was my fifth-grade English teacher, and while she never said anything directly at first, I started to notice how she looked at me differently. She didn't have that exhausted, irritated gaze most adults wore when dealing with kids like me. The day after the chair incident, she asked if I could help her organize books during lunch. I said yes, not because I cared about books, but because it meant I didn't have to pretend I was okay in the cafeteria again. That first lunch in her room was mostly silent. I shelved dog-eared copies of old novels while she graded papers. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable, it felt like breathing room. Over the next few days, she started asking questions. What kind of books I liked. What kind of music I listened to. What I liked to draw. No one had ever asked those things before, not even my parents. At home, things didn't change. Deborah still called me lazy when I got home tired, even if I had spent hours helping around the house. Frank would ask how school was, then interrupt halfway through my answer to complain about the bills or the government. Madison got new clothes, new shoes, new everything, while I wore second-hand uniforms that didn't quite fit. At dinner, I barely spoke. No one noticed. But I started writing in a notebook I kept hidden under my bed. At school, Miss Teresa noticed I was drawing more. She asked if I ever wrote stories. I said no, but I was lying. I just didn't think what I wrote counted as stories. That journal became my life raft. I wrote about everything, the bullying, the silence, the way I hated myself for not being stronger, louder, better. I wrote about wanting to disappear. But I also wrote about the feeling I had when Miss Teresa asked about my day, or when she gave me a book to borrow over the weekend, or when she told me my voice mattered, even if it trembled. Once, during a short reading assignment, we read a story about a boy who prayed under his covers at night, even though his parents didn't believe in anything. Miss Teresa didn't say much, but afterwards she handed me a note folded in half. It just said, "You're not invisible to God." Everything else in my life was gray, but moments with her felt like flashes of color. I started to crave those 20 minutes in her room more than anything. It was the only time of day I didn't feel like I was made of glass. One day, near the end of the semester, she found me crying in the hallway after Josh had slammed my locker shut on my hand. She didn't say anything, just walked with me to the nurse's office and sat with me the whole time. Later that week, she gave me a small, leather-bound Bible with my name written inside the cover. "You don't have to believe anything yet," she said, "but if someday you need something bigger than all this, maybe this will help." I didn't open it for weeks, but when I did, it was because I had nothing else left. And in a strange way, it didn't feel like I was reading it for the first time. It felt like it had been waiting for me. I started carrying the Bible in my backpack, hidden in the inside pocket like some kind of secret survival tool I wasn't ready to admit I needed. I never read it at home. That would have led to too many questions and even more judgment. Frank didn't like those people who used God as a crutch, and Deborah once mocked our elderly neighbor for praying over her garden. But at school, when the lunchroom got too loud or the hallways felt like they were closing in, I'd sneak away to the bathroom and read a few lines. I didn't understand most of it. Some words sounded ancient, other parts felt like riddles, but something about it calmed me. I didn't know it then, but it wasn't just about belief. It was about finally having something that felt like it was mine. Miss Teresa kept looking out for me, even when she didn't say anything. She'd smile at me in the hall or leave a post-it note on my desk that said, "You matter," or "Keep going." When I got sick one week and missed 3 days of school, she sent a card home through the office. Inside it said, "Even if no one notices you're gone." I did. I kept that card in the same pocket as the Bible. Some days, that combination felt like the only proof I existed at all. I didn't tell anyone about her kindness, not even Madison. I didn't trust people not to ruin good things, especially when life had taught me that good things never lasted. Then 5th grade ended, and with it, my time with Miss Teresa. She wasn't part of the middle school faculty, and once I crossed that threshold into 6th grade, it was like stepping into another version of hell. The building was bigger, the teachers were colder, and the bullying became more physical than verbal. Josh was still around, now taller and crueler, and his crew had grown. I had a new locker, but somehow they always found me. Once they shoved me into a janitor's closet and left me there during lunch. No one came looking. I waited in the dark for nearly 30 minutes, staring at mop buckets and bleach bottles, wondering if this was how my life would always be. The worst part was the isolation. In elementary school, I was lonely, but I had Miss Teresa. In middle school, I had no one. The teachers didn't learn names, only troublemakers or stars. I was neither. One time, I tried to speak up after a kid dumped his milk on my backpack, but the principal asked me if I had provoked the situation. I went home soaking, and Deborah yelled at me for ruining another shirt. When I tried to tell her what happened, she waved me off and said I needed to grow up. Frank just muttered something about how real men don't tattletale. I wanted to scream, but I was so used to swallowing everything that even silence hurt less than speaking. The school had a counselor named Ms. Amy who was supposed to help with emotional development or something like that. I was called to her office once because I hadn't turned in homework for a week. She had a soft voice and a colorful office with motivational posters that made me feel more trapped than inspired. She asked me if I was struggling emotionally, and I remember just staring at the fish tank behind her desk, counting bubbles so I wouldn't cry. I didn't trust her, not because she was mean, but because she looked like someone who would file a report and forget my name by Friday. After that meeting, nothing changed. She sent an email to my parents. Frank ignored it. Deborah accused me of trying to embarrass her by acting mentally unstable. I stopped talking to adults altogether for a while. That winter, things got worse. Madison was cast as the lead in the school's holiday play, and the entire house revolved around her rehearsals and costume fittings. Meanwhile, I had started skipping lunch just to avoid being seen. My grades slipped, and my teachers wrote generic notes home like, "David appears distracted in class." No one asked why. No one ever does. I stopped journaling too. Frank found one of my older notebooks while looking for something in my room and started reading it out loud in the kitchen like it was stand-up comedy. "Listen to this garbage," he said, quoting a passage I wrote about wanting to disappear. "Kid thinks he's a poet or something." Maybe you should join the circus." He laughed while Deborah told him to stop, but not because she cared, because it was making dinner uncomfortable. I grabbed the journal and ran outside without shoes. It was snowing, and I didn't stop until I reached the back fence. I stayed there until my feet went numb. That night, I hid the Bible under my pillow. I didn't read it. I just needed to know it was there. It was the only thing that hadn't turned against me yet. I started sneaking into the library more often, not to study, but because no one went there during lunch. I'd sit between the shelves in the nonfiction section and just breathe. One afternoon, I found a small flyer tucked inside a returned book. It was for a local youth group that met on Wednesdays at a church not far from school. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't believe in miracles or hope or anything like that, but something told me to keep it. 2 weeks later, I showed up. I told Deborah I had a group project and needed to stay late. She didn't ask questions. Frank wasn't even home. I walked 10 blocks in the cold with my hoodie pulled tight and the flyer in my pocket. The church looked older than I expected. Stained glass, chipped stone steps, and a big wooden cross above the door that made me feel both exposed and safe at the same time. Inside, a group of maybe 20 kids were sitting in a circle, laughing and talking like they actually liked being there. I stood in the doorway for almost a full minute before someone noticed me. A man in his 60s, kind eyes, balding head, and a navy sweater came over. "You're new," he said. "I'm Leon. You're welcome here." I wanted to believe him, but I had heard that phrase before from people who didn't mean it. Still, I nodded and sat near the edge of the circle. I didn't say much. They played a game. They read something from the Bible. They prayed. I didn't join in. I just watched. Leon didn't pressure me, didn't call on me, didn't make it weird. At the end, he walked me out and said, "If you ever need to talk, I'm around." I didn't respond. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about how nobody laughed when I spoke. No one rolled their eyes. I wasn't invisible. Not there. That night, I opened the Bible again. I turned to a random page and read, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I read it again, then a third time. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I just sat there, holding the book in my lap, and whispered, "Please don't leave me too." I kept going back to the church every Wednesday, even when it snowed hard or I had to lie about where I was going. That small group of strangers started feeling more like home than anything I'd ever known. I didn't speak much at first. I'd sit and listen while others shared stories about faith or school or relationships. Some talked about things they were grateful for. Others cried and admitted how lost they felt. No one interrupted them. No one rolled their eyes or told them to toughen up. Mr. Leon always waited until everyone had spoken before he said anything, and when he did, it was usually short but powerful. He never quoted scripture like a weapon. He just asked questions that made you think deeper than you were ready for. One night after group, he caught me lingering near the back as everyone else left. He didn't ask why I looked anxious or tired or empty. He just said, "You can always stay and help clean up if you need an excuse to stay longer." I nodded without speaking. We wiped down tables in silence for a while, and then he handed me a folded piece of paper. It had a handwritten quote that said, "What people reject, God restores." That sentence stayed with me all the way home, and I tucked it inside the same Bible Ms. Teresa gave me. By then, that book had become a container for everything good I didn't want to lose: notes, cards, quotes, even a tiny Polaroid someone had taken of the group laughing together. None of it looked like much to anyone else, but to me it felt like proof I still existed in someone's memory. At school, things didn't get easier. Josh and his friends never ran out of ways to make me feel worthless. They'd throw food at my locker, spread rumors about me being weird or mentally unstable, and once even tore pages out of my notebook and taped them to the hallway walls. Teachers didn't intervene. Most of them saw me as a quiet background student who didn't cause problems and therefore didn't need attention. When I tried to report what happened, the vice principal asked if I thought I was overreacting. "Boys will be boys," he said, smiling like it was all just part of growing up. I stopped trying after that. Instead, I started keeping a second notebook, one I never brought to school. I filled it with prayers I didn't know were prayers. Questions, rants, begging. Some pages were just scribbles. Others were detailed entries where I imagined a different version of myself, one who could walk into a room without scanning for exits. Frank lost his job that spring. The house became even more unbearable. He started drinking again, sitting in the dark living room with the TV on mute, staring at the screen without blinking. Deborah took up more shifts at the pharmacy and came home exhausted, irritated, and always ready to take her disappointment out on someone. Madison remained untouched, shielded, and adored. If she got a B+ on a test, there was ice cream and praise. I brought home a straight A report card once, and my father didn't even look up from his chair. He just asked if I was trying to show off. I remember thinking in that moment how insane it was that love in our house had to be earned, and even when you earned it, it still wasn't guaranteed. I started spending more time away from home. After school, I'd sit in the church parking lot, sometimes for hours, just writing or reading or waiting for someone to notice I hadn't gone home yet. Mr. Leon eventually started keeping a folding chair for me in his office. He never made a big deal about it. He'd just unlock the side door, leave a bottle of water on the desk, and let me be. Some days he'd ask how I was doing. Other times he'd just nod and walk out, giving me space to exist without pressure. That was the part one never got anywhere else, space to just be without having to earn my right to breathe. Then I made a friend, and everything shifted. His name was Connor, a kid in my geometry class who transferred from another district. He wasn't loud or overly friendly. He just had this way of noticing people without staring through them. One day, I dropped my calculator and muttered something under my breath. He laughed and said, "Yeah, same." It was the most ordinary interaction, but it stuck. Over the next few weeks, we started talking more about homework, music, random jokes that only made sense to us. He never asked questions that felt like traps. He didn't make me explain why I was so quiet all the time. He just accepted it. One Friday, after school, he asked if I wanted to hang out at the mall food court. I said yes before I could overthink it, then panicked the whole bus ride there. But it turned out okay. We ate fries, made fun of store mannequins, and sat in silence without it feeling awkward. Connor didn't go to church, but he didn't make fun of me when I mentioned youth group. He just said, "That's cool, man," like it was totally normal. That one sentence meant more than he probably realized. I had never had a friend who didn't immediately pull away when things got personal. I never told him everything, but I didn't have to. He could read it on my face. Once, I came to school with a bruise on my side. Frank had thrown a shoe at me after I spilled soup on the rug, and Connor didn't ask what happened. He just offered me his jacket like it was a reflex. That gesture made something tighten in my throat. For once, someone saw me and didn't look away. That spring, youth group started preparing for a weekend retreat, an overnight trip into the woods with team-building activities and prayer circles and campfires. Mr. Leon handed me a permission slip and said I didn't have to come, but he'd save me a seat if I did. I hesitated for days. I didn't think Frank or Deborah would sign it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go anyway. But Connor said he'd heard those retreats were actually chill, not overly preachy. So I forged the signature and packed a bag with clothes, my Bible, and the folded note Miss Teresa once gave me. It felt like I was bringing pieces of every version of myself, broken, scared, hopeful, into one place. That weekend changed something in me. It wasn't just the nature or the songs or the silence under the stars. It was how I felt sitting by the fire with kids who didn't know everything about me but still saved me a seat. We talked about things we'd never said aloud before. I admitted I used to believe I was a mistake, and no one laughed or looked uncomfortable. Mr. Leon just nodded and said, "A mistake wouldn't be here right now, helping others feel seen." I didn't cry then. I waited until everyone went to bed, and I sat alone near the river, listening to the water and whispering things I was too afraid to say out loud. If you're real, if you hear me, please don't let me go. By the time high school started, I was good at hiding things. I had learned how to keep my voice even when I was screaming inside. I knew how to take a hit without flinching, how to keep secrets without writing them down, and how to pass as normal in a classroom full of kids who had no idea what surviving meant. Freshman year hit hard. New building, new teachers, new bullies, but the same gnawing ache inside my chest that never really left. The only thing different was that now I had Connor, and somehow that was enough to keep me from slipping back into the dark completely. We had a few classes together and started walking home sometimes, mostly because the buses were crowded and loud. I never invited him over. He never asked why. I appreciated that more than he'll ever know. He'd tell me about his stepdad, who wasn't awful but wasn't really there either. I'd nod and offer vague responses about how things were fine, and he'd nod like he knew they weren't but wouldn't push me anyway. One day, he brought up the retreat again and said, "You ever think about going back? Even just to visit?" I shrugged and said I'd been thinking about it. Truth was, I hadn't stopped thinking about it since we came back. That church started to feel like a second home, but when I had to sneak into like a stowaway, I'd still show up on Wednesdays and sometimes Sundays if I could lie my way out of family brunches. Mr. Leon always welcomed me without comment, even when I arrived late or looked like I hadn't slept in days. He had this way of making you feel like showing up was enough. No questions, no expectations, just a chair, a warm smile, and the quiet understanding that maybe you were carrying more than you could say. Meanwhile, things at home got worse. Frank never really bounced back from losing his job. He took work under the table, fixing things or hauling scrap, and came home angry more often than not. Deborah stayed tired and bitter, snapping at everyone except Madison, who was still the sun around which the entire house revolved. I once heard her tell a neighbor that David just hasn't found his thing yet, like I was some malfunctioning appliance still under warranty. I wanted to scream. Maybe if you had looked at me like I mattered, I could have been something. But I didn't. I just went back to my room and reread the same verse from Matthew over and over, like it could hold me together if I clung hard enough. During the spring semester, I got assigned a group project with a few kids I didn't know well. One of them, a girl named Lila, was nice enough but mostly did her part and kept to herself. Josh was also in our group. Yes, the same Josh from middle school, who somehow still carried the same mean streak but had learned to hide it under sarcasm and forced charm. He acted like we were old friends, calling me Bible boy in front of everyone and laughing like it was just a joke. The others laughed too, not because it was funny, but because laughing is easier than being the next target. I smiled through it. I always did. That week I stayed late to work on the project in the library. Connor stopped by to return a book and sat with me for a bit. We didn't talk much, but I showed him some sketches I'd been working on. He said I should take art more seriously. "You ever think about submitting this stuff somewhere?" I laughed and said no one cared what came out of my head. But he didn't laugh with me. He looked at me like I had said something dangerous. "I care," he said, and he meant it. That was the night I realized just how deeply I had trained myself to expect the worst. Even kindness felt like a setup sometimes. That Friday, Mr. Leon pulled me aside after group. He said he had something for me. It was an old journal, leather-bound, with blank pages and a note inside. "Write the truth, even the parts you're afraid to say out loud." I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether I felt grateful or terrified. He told me he believed I had something inside me worth sharing, not just surviving. I nodded and took it home. That night, I wrote more than I had in months. I didn't just write about pain. I wrote about hope. I wrote about Miss Teresa. I wrote about Connor. I wrote about how I didn't know if God loved me, but I wanted to believe he did. A few days later, I stayed late after school, and when I came home, I found Frank sitting on my bed holding the journal. He had read it, every word, and the look on his face wasn't angry, it was disgusted. "You still playing the victim?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. "Still thinking you're special because you cry in notebooks and hang around churches?" I tried to grab it back, but he threw it across the room. "You're not broken, David. You're just weak." I left the house that night and didn't come back until dawn. I sat on the steps of the church, hugging my knees to my chest, waiting for someone to open the doors. Mr. Leon arrived before sunrise. He didn't ask what happened. He unlocked the door, walked to his office, and came back with a blanket and a cup of tea. We didn't talk. We just sat in silence as the sky turned from black to gray to soft blue. That morning was the first time I truly felt what peace could be, even if it was temporary. I told him what happened, and he didn't offer advice. He just said, "They don't get to name you." I didn't understand it then, but it hit me hard later. For years, I had let Frank and Deborah define me, call me lazy, mistake, failure, weird. I had worn those names like they were stitched into my skin. After that, something started to shift. I didn't become brave overnight. I still flinched when Frank raised his voice. I still hesitated before speaking in class. but I started drawing more. I filled sketchbooks with images of places I wished I could go: mountains, oceans, cathedrals, wide open fields. I started volunteering at the church on weekends, helping clean or set up for events. Connor came with me once, and afterward he said, "You're different here." He didn't mean it as a compliment or an insult, just an observation. But he was right. In that space, I wasn't hiding. Then one Sunday evening, the youth group held an open mic night. People shared poems, songs, little speeches about their faith journeys. Mr. Leon asked if I wanted to go up. My instinct was to say no. But then I remembered what he said: "They don't get to name you." So I stepped up. My hands shook. My throat felt like sandpaper. But I read something I had written the night Frank found my journal. It wasn't perfect. My voice cracked. But no one laughed. No one left. When I finished, people clapped, not out of politeness, but because they saw me. Really saw me. And for the first time in my life, I saw myself, too. Senior year came faster than I expected, and for the first time in my life, I didn't dread waking up every morning. Things at home hadn't changed much. Frank was still cold, Deborah still sharp, and Madison still adored. But something inside me had shifted permanently. I no longer lived for their approval or waited for their validation like air. I had finally accepted that some people, even the ones who raise you, may never learn how to love what they don't understand. And that realization, painful as it was, gave me room to grow into someone who didn't need to be pitted, fixed, or hidden anymore. I kept drawing. What started as a coping mechanism slowly became something more powerful, a language I could use when words felt too fragile. Mr. Leon helped me find a nonprofit that hosted local art competitions and even offered scholarships. He wrote me a letter of recommendation, simple and honest, saying that I was the kind of young man who rebuilds from ashes and still finds a way to lift others. I cried reading it, not because of what it meant for college, but because it was the first time I felt seen by an adult who expected nothing in return. I submitted a piece, a charcoal sketch of a boy alone in a crowd, half-shadowed, with one small hand holding light. It didn't win, but it was displayed in a public library downtown, and Connor dragged me there 3 separate times to stand in front of it and grin like a proud parent. Around that time, I started mentoring a few younger kids in the church's youth program. One boy in particular, Noah, reminded me of myself at 12, nervous, quiet, always staring at the floor when people spoke to him. I didn't force conversation. I just sat next to him when he didn't want to join group games and handed him markers and paper when he couldn't find the words. One night, he handed me a drawing of a figure surrounded by shadows, with a tiny golden cross glowing near the chest. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. I kept that drawing in the back of my Bible, behind the note Miss Teresa wrote me all those years ago. Speaking of her, I found out she passed away near the end of my junior year. Cancer. No one told me when it happened, and by the time I found out, the funeral had already passed. I sat in my room that night holding the small leather Bible she gave me in 5th grade and reread the message she wrote on the inside cover. "You are not forgotten." I whispered it out loud like a prayer I hadn't said in years. The next day, I went to the cemetery and found her grave. No one else was there. I sat cross-legged in the grass and told her everything she had missed, how I didn't vanish, how someone finally heard me, how I was helping other kids now the way she once helped me. I left a pencil and a sketch folded with a quote from Proverbs tucked into it: "The one who refreshes others will himself be refreshed." I cried all the way home, but it wasn't the hollow kind of crying. It was the kind that waters something living. I didn't stay close with my family after graduation. I moved out at 18, thanks to a small scholarship and a part-time job at a bookstore near campus. I still see Madison sometimes, especially now that she's older and starting to question the version of our parents she once idolized. A few months ago, she sent me a letter. In it, she apologized for not seeing what I was going through, for laughing at jokes she didn't realize were cruel, for thinking I was distant when really I was just surviving. She said she wished she had asked more questions. I wrote her back and told her she was a kid, and kids don't always know what pain looks like until they feel it themselves. I told her I forgave her before she ever asked. As for Frank and Deborah, they never apologized. I don't expect them to. I don't need them to. I've learned that healing isn't something you wait for others to give you. It's something you fight for, bleed for, build from scraps when no one else believes in the blueprint. I still pray, not because I expect all my problems to vanish, but because somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling alone when I did. God didn't swoop in and rescue me like some storybook miracle, but He walked beside me in silence when I needed someone most, and that presence, quiet and steady, saved me more than I can explain. I'm studying psychology now with plans to work with at-risk youth. When I told Mr. Leon, he smiled and said, I had a feeling. I spend my weekends volunteering, mostly one-on-one sessions with kids who think no one would care if they disappeared. I never start with scripture. I start with listening. Because that's what I needed most when I was drowning, someone who didn't try to fix me, but stayed close enough that I didn't drift further away. Sometimes, late at night, I reread the early pages of the journal Mr. Leon gave me, the one that nearly broke me when Frank found it. The entries are raw, messy, filled with fear and doubt and words I never thought I'd survive. And yet here I am, still here, still building, still believing that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't a mistake after all.